Our study of the book of Proverbs will have just two parts rather than the usual three, and the first of them will start now, looking at chapters 1 to 9 of the book. Before the time when these proverbs were formed into a collection, there was already an existing wisdom tradition in both Egypt and Babylon, and these first 9 chapters show very clear similarities to the collections in those countries. The main purpose, especially of Egyptian wisdom literature, was to give instruction to people like civil servants as to the way that they should live. It was unashamedly instructing them in the way to go through life without rocking the boat, preserving the status quo. Past generations passing on instructions for living in the world that those past generations had created. That, of course, is pretty much the opposite of what the world tends to expect today. These days, each new generation is rather expected to turn its back on the past and create a new world of its own. My own opinion is that real wisdom for our day is somewhere in between those two attitudes. I think there has to be reality in one generation passing on what it's made of the world and what it's learnt about living in that world. And yet the pace, particularly of technological change, means that many of the challenges that people face today don't have immediate parallels in yesterday's world. So today's people have substantial work to do in discovering what works today. That being said, I think the world would be in a lot better place to live in if more of today's generation took more notice of the accumulated wisdom of the ages. More of it is good for today than most of today's people like to think. But before we proceed, we better reflect a little on the meaning of the word wisdom. When I've been teaching statistics, I've often taught people who've had to write reports for their bosses on the basis of data that they've gathered. I then have to help them to understand the difference between data and information. Information has to inform, and raw data doesn't do that, not until someone has analysed it and summarised it in some sort of way. Well, when I'm in the mood to blether on, I sometimes then ponder with them as to what happens to the information that they give to their bosses. The most obvious product of that information is knowledge, that the boss then knows facts which they didn't know before. If they then reflect on that knowledge, they may gain understanding, an appreciation of how various facts relate to each other and of what they mean. Perhaps the most that they can hope for is that the bosses then acquire wisdom, the ability to know which bit of their knowledge or understanding applies to what and when. Wisdom then is knowledge and understanding appropriately applied to real life. In the ancient Egyptian setting, that wisdom was gained by people reflecting on what had worked and on what had gummed up the works in previous generations. They then set out to teach that wisdom to new generations, trying, as every parent does, to spare their children the pain of discovering all the nasty bits for themselves. Well, you might expect that when you get a similar collection of wisdom in the Bible, wisdom there will be much more spiritual, much more theological, that it will deal with spiritual things, and that it will condense what I would call theological ethics, rather than just have one generation telling another how not to mess it up. Well, there is some of that in the book of Proverbs, but there's a lot more that isn't particularly spiritual or theological, just plain common sense and experience of life. Let's have a look then at some of the features of these first 9 chapters of the book. Take a look for a start at chapter 6, verses 30 to 35. This is interesting in that there's no suggestion here that theft and adultery are wrong, just the observation that there are too many situations in which those actions seriously fail to win friends and influence people. These are pragmatic reasons for not thieving and for not committing adultery. They're not the result of theological ethics saying that it's wrong. And we'll get quite a bit of that in the whole of the book of Proverbs, not least in the first 9 chapters. Let's go back to the beginning, well, almost to the beginning, chapter 1, verses 8 and 9. This is a typical sort of formula. In our present culture, you might try to tell the children how not to get it wrong, but most parents fear that it will be their lot to watch their children take no notice of them at all and mess it up all the same. Parents these days typically have to wait until the children have made something of that discovery for themselves and can then possibly adopt an approach to life which involves their parents a bit more, involves them in cooperating with what their parents can contribute to them. Parents, of course, will still try to pass on their wisdom. Often it comes over as the triumph of hope over experience. Flip through to chapter 4, verses 18 and 19. What does this remind you of? Well, it reminds me of Psalm 1, which for some reason I was made to learn by rote at school. The Psalms might not strike you at first as wisdom literature, but there is a strong strand of wisdom running through the Psalms. And here these categories, the righteous and the wicked, these categories are typical of wisdom language. Chapter 5, verses 15 to 18, and chapter 6, verses 6 to 8. If you'd like to have a look at those two bits. If you forget these references, by the way, they're on the handout, which is below the picture in YouTube. Notice the use here of imagery. It's direct. It's asking you to form an immediate and obvious comparison between the picture and the subject in hand. In some other forms of Proverbs, images are more cryptic, posing something of a riddle for the reader to decode. And some expositions of Old Testament wisdom literature make it seem as if the riddle type is all there is. Well, that's not true. These instructional passages are usually much more straightforward. They're telling you what to do rather than setting you a riddle. In chapter 6, verses 16 to 19, you might read this and think that the writer here just can't count. Having created a list of 6 things, he realizes that the list contains 7 items and he has to correct the introduction, which, as a maths teacher of many years standing, I would say that entitles me to tell that old gag about there being 3 kinds of mathematicians, those who can count and those who can't. If you're not a mathematician, you're not allowed to pass that joke on. But it's nothing to do with that. This is just a favourite way of introducing a list. It's a bit quirky, but it's a matter of style, and it's pretty much wisdom literature style. Look now in chapter 3 at verses 19 and 20. This seems to be a description of the Lord creating the world, using his own wisdom and understanding. Okay. But what about this in chapter 8, 22 to 31, if you'd like to read that? Here, wisdom is treated as a person who does the creating along with the Lord himself. And what does that remind you of? Clearly, the very beginning of John's Gospel. There, the Word is personified in a very similar way. And many commentators believe that the personification of wisdom in the wisdom literature is the immediate precursor of the way that John wrote in his prologue. Well, that seems good sense, although what John says goes a long way beyond anything done in the wisdom literature. He might have stolen an idea from the Old Testament, but he certainly hasn't taken over all the content of what wisdom literature invested in that idea. In fact, the whole of Proverbs 8 to 9, chapter 8 and chapter 9, the whole of that is in praise of this personified wisdom. In both Hebrew and Greek, the word for wisdom is a feminine word, so when personified in either of those languages, wisdom turns out to be a female. Well, we've been looking at the first 9 chapters of Proverbs. There are other sections of the book which come over in a very similar way to these 9 chapters. For instance, 22:17 to 22:17 to 24:22 is a set of 30 wise sayings, and they're connected together in the same sort of way as the first 9 chapters are. Or in chapter 31, verses 1 to 9, the sayings of King Lemuel. Don't feel inferior if you don't know who King Lemuel is. No one else does either. So if you're looking at these connected chapters, we've got a lot of it in the first 9 chapters and just these little bits of it elsewhere. And in our second exploration of Proverbs, we're going to look at the rest. So apart from the passages that we've just noted in our first section, the rest of the book of Proverbs is made up basically of one-liners. Proverbs which consist of a single sentence, usually written as a couple, the two halves of the sentence balancing each other in some way. The impression you get is that any grouping of these sayings is done by editors. Sometimes a few one-liners are grouped together because they all deal with the same sort of subject, or because they're playing the tennis elbow foot game. A tag in one leads on into a tag in the next one. It's very difficult to give any sort of overview of this kind of stuff. I find it extremely difficult because my mind works by seeing the connections between things or the shape that they create together, but these chapters are by their nature disconnected. They are not trying to create any particular overall shape apart from increasing your respect for wisdom. If you skim through the rest of the book from chapter 10 onwards, shall we say in NIV, it works in NIV, it might do in the Bible you've got as well, you'll see that each verse is printed separately from neighbouring verses. This is the printer recognising the one-liner nature of the material. Well, we shan't make any effort to survey the content of these chapters, just to dip into them here and there, testing some of the different kinds of sayings that there are. I said testing, I meant tasting, of course. Chapter 10, verse 5. This is very unusual because you get the impression that the subject in hand is not really harvesting, but a much wider view of people's behaviour. In some ways, this verse is behaving like a poem, in the way that it starts to ring bells which are at some distance from the harvest field. In some ways, of course, it's functioning as a parable, a piece of imagery which engages you and then suddenly makes you realise that it's judging the way that you behave. I hope you don't believe all that stuff about parables being earthly stories with heavenly meanings, making it easier for people to understand Jesus. There are stories or images which come out of the scenario they appear to be describing and judge you, even when you live in a different world from the one that's being pictured, and they can be quite uncomfortable to listen to. Let's take a look at one category of Proverbs here. There are a lot of them which are covering the same sort of territory that we found in the first 9 chapters, instructions for living, which condense the experience of past generations and don't necessarily have anything much to do with theology or spirituality. I'm not going to trouble you by ploughing here through a lot of examples of them, but there's quite several examples on the handout below the picture in YouTube if you want to look through them. Another category are those which are concerned with preserving society. They are describing how things can go wrong in a community and therefore how to avoid that happening. Yes, most of them are negative. And there's a list of examples of those on the handout. Then there are more spiritual sayings. Some of these are one-liners which seem to have rather more to do with the faith held by the Israelites. Either they directly mention the Lord, or they have a perspective which we would identify as a product of faith. Look, for instance, at chapter 10, verse 2, which involves the idea of righteousness. Now, the whole idea of righteousness is God-based. Most of the one-liners which betray their faith origins actually use the concept of righteousness in doing so. Or look at the next verse, chapter 10, verse 3. This proverb isn't describing a necessary characteristic of life in this world. It's saying what the Lord does to modify the usual worldly cause and effect. And I think it's fair to say that this is pretty much the approach of the Beatitudes at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, because they're not describing how life is, they're describing how it can become when the Lord gets going in it. Or the very first verse of chapter 11. This is interesting because something here is held to be wrong because it displeases the Lord. Now that's a totally different reason for disapproval from the argument in chapter 6 that we looked at earlier. This is a theological reason for taking a particular line rather than a pragmatic reason. And chapter 12 verse 2 introduces the notion of the Lord judging someone's conduct. So we're again here in the spiritual stroke theological realm rather than the practical realm. And there is some of that stuff in the book of Proverbs. Not as much as you might expect just from thinking, well, it's in the Bible, it's all about God, isn't it? Most of it isn't. Most of it is common sense reaction to the business of living in today's world. There are just a few other bits I ought to mention. The last two chapters, for instance, are quite different from all these one-liners. We've already noticed the sayings of King Lemuel at the beginning of chapter 21, and notice that that's part of that more or less secular wisdom similar to the Egyptian tradition. Chapter 30 begins with the sayings of Agur, whoever he was. My guess is that the title is supposed to cover down to about verse 9, because this appears to be a continuous passage in which Agur is approaching the Lord and trying to make his peace with them. If you don't read any of the rest, I suggest you read of their verses 7 to 9. Most of the rest of chapter 30 is a collection of numbered sayings, and from verse 15 onwards, or the middle of verse 15 onwards. So that forms a sort of collection, but only in that they're tied into a sequence of numbers. And then the conclusion of the book, chapter 31, verses 10 onwards, is a sustained poem in praise of a virtuous wife. But I mean, if this woman is a virtuous, she's not. She's Superwoman. She's doing everything that all the best women in the world do, but she's doing them all the same time, all wrapped up in the one person. Utterly wonderful, utterly unbelievable. But it's a celebrated passage all the same. I will leave you then to flick through the book of Proverbs. You know now to expect something different in the first 9 chapters, more continuity there than you do in the rest. In the rest of it, you're mostly just looking at odd verses and seeing if they ring a bell with you. And if you've got this kind of mind in which you remember some of those verses, then some of those proverbs may turn out to be useful to you in your daily living. And at that point, we leave the book of Proverbs.